Does it ever become lonely being so unpopular in your viewpoints?
Yes, often.
Devil's Advocate.
With Skyler Turden. All right, welcome back to another edition of Devil's Advocate. I'm your host here, Skyler Turden. Today we have a very special guest who has a very lengthy resume that he wanted me to read for him. He worked at ABC, 2020, Fox News, a lot of books that he's written. You can follow him online at johnstossel.com. And of course, he has channels all over social media, Stossel TV. Dr. John Stossel, thanks for taking the time.
I'm not a doctor.
Okay, so Johnny, it is. We're going to be talking today about single-payer health care. This was, I believe, by your request. That's a hot-button issue for you, correct?
One of many.
Okay, great. And I know you fancy yourself more of a libertarian, so not really like a populist sort of conservative. I just want to make sure off the bat I'm not getting anything incorrect or misrepresenting your views.
Yes, I'm a pure libertarian.
Okay. So what would you say is your primary issue then with a libertarian? I would presuppose being interested in human rights and personal liberties. What would be your issue with what would be a vast improvement over our current healthcare system? Single-payer healthcare.
Well, by single payer, you mean the government just pays for everything?
Well, I think that's a bit reductive and oversimplification, but a single-payer option where the government could provide an option for affordable health care for, the most vulnerable among us. Let's go with that.
Well, I thought we have that. We spend $1 trillion a year on health care for the poor.
Okay, so then in your estimation, why does not everyone have affordable health care in this country?
Because when everything seems to be free, it gets screwed up horribly. And the only thing that works anywhere in any consumer transaction is the free market. And we're not even close to that in healthcare. We're already heavily socialized. And you idiots want to make it worse? I think that would be tragic.
Well, we're only 2 minutes in out of the gate with the name calling. I wouldn't want to go in for a checkup with you as my doctor. Let me ask you.
I wouldn't recommend that either.
No, I'm glad we both agree on that. Free market, right now, if I'm not mistaken, especially with the repeal of certain policies from the Affordable Care Act, from none other than your president, President Trump, the free market doesn't seem to be working. Costs are going up. You can correct me if I'm wrong there, but if the free market is so effective and we're the most free market healthcare economy, why is our healthcare more expensive here as a percentage of GDP than like socialized countries? Why do you think?
Because we invent stuff and we have a bureaucratic government that makes everything cost more. Already, the only thing that really makes a market work is when the individual spends his own money. In healthcare, 7 out of $8 are spent either by the government or private insurance companies. And you can call them private, but it's the worst form of capitalism because they're making decisions for all their customers. And then many people want to cheat them. And so they spend a lot of time and money on paperwork trying to stop cheating, and all that makes things cost more. Well, that's part of it. The other reason is the rest of the world freeloads off our innovation.
Oh, really? How's that?
We invent the drugs, then they copy them and use them. We invent the best technology, and that's expensive. And the government makes it more expensive because it takes 10 to 12 years to get a drug approved.
Sure. Well, listen, I certainly wouldn't dispute that more drugs are invented here, and certainly under this capitalist economy that the pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money, but I don't really see it as a virtue when people's lives are at stakes.
People's lives are always at stake, and I'm really glad that when I'm in pain, a pharmaceutical company may have invented something that'll make it better. And if that costs more, so be it.
Yeah, sometimes it costs an opioid addiction, but whatever. Let's get to the libertarian side of things here. You're all about basic human rights. I know Second Amendment, obviously a big freedom guy. Why do you not consider healthcare a fundamental human right as a libertarian?
Take gun rights. That's a right to be left alone and have a gun. Free speech is a right to speak.
Sure.
The right to health care means you're saying you have a right to force other people to pay for your care. That's very different.
How is it different from, say, car insurance?
I pay for my own car insurance. Also, in car insurance, insurance companies are allowed to price the insurance according to your risk. If I have a lot of accidents or if I'm just 17 years old, they charge more. If I'm a man, they charge more because, well, we men think we drive better. We do get into more accidents.
Right.
And that's only just. That's insurance. But with health insurance, because of your foolish politician friends, you're not allowed to discriminate, as they call it, against women or people with pre-existing conditions. That's not insurance. That's welfare.
So you think it would be fixed if we could, I just want to make sure I understand this, if we could discriminate against women, that's what would fix the current healthcare epidemic?
If insurance companies could charge women more, because women go to the doctor much more often and incur far higher costs, then insurance would be real insurance. It wouldn't fix everything, no.
Sure. Well, the reason to bring up car insurance is because, yes, you pay for it, but you are required to purchase car insurance. I do appreciate you recognizing that particularly white males are involved in more car accidents, so clearly not pulled over as often, so I'm sure you've recognized that about yourself. But you are by law required to purchase car insurance, of course, in most states if you want to drive an automobile vehicle. So why would we not apply that basic principle to people's lives and healthcare?
The principle behind being forced to buy car insurance is that if an irresponsible person, like, say, you, crashes into me and I incur terrible costs and you don't have insurance, I'm just screwed. So governments, I'm not saying it's a good idea, require us to buy liability insurance.
Sure. And if people
shouldn't have to buy casualty insurance to cover the cost of our own cars, and we shouldn't have to buy health insurance to cover our own bodies.
Sure, I understand that in theory. I know capitalists often like to act as though socialists and students of people like Marx and Lenin really live in theory, but it does seem as though you're living in theory as opposed to the real world where healthcare costs, if someone doesn't have insurance, if they're not forced to purchase insurance, it ends up being more costly down the line. So if someone doesn't purchase health insurance and something catastrophic happens, we end up with the epidemic of the United States spending more as a part of their GDP, right, on healthcare. Not to mention the quality of care. We'll get into that in a second. Don't get me wrong. We'll get into that in a second. But we spend more on average as a part of our GDP than places like, say, Norway or Canada, and that's because a lot of people don't purchase health insurance.
It's because people don't buy health insurance. The spending includes insurance and out-of-pocket costs. So I don't see how whether they buy health insurance makes a difference.
Well, if you don't see it, then there's no explaining it to you. Let's move on to quality of care. With all this money going around, obviously, and choice and free market, as you put it, why does the United States have worse health care than places like the UK? It doesn't even rank in the top 10. I mean, that's pretty empirical.
Empirical according to whom? Who says we have worse health care?
Well, if you look at national indexes and ratings according to people who use the health care, the United States healthcare is not rated as highly as places like Canada and places with a lot of single-payer systems. So,
Well, studies by some smart, some foolish people have concluded that we spend a ton of money, and yet we die younger. And the reason for that, however, compared, say, to Norway or Switzerland, is not because our healthcare is inferior. It's because we drive less, we drive more, we shoot each other more often, and more of us are fat. If you take out obesity and car accidents and gunshot injuries and deaths, we live longer than people in most other countries. If you take out the underclass in America, the group of people who have been taught by the welfare state to become dependent, who are often obese, who don't take care of themselves well, then Americans live longer than most anyone.
Well, that didn't take very long to turn around a national crisis and blame it on the vulnerable welfare recipients. That was fast. You think this is we're here at this problem right now because of people who need a leg up with Social Security?
No, but I think the statistic about why Americans don't live as long as people in other countries is because we're fat, we drive more, and we shoot each other more often, and because we have an underclass.
Well, I'm not talking about just I'm not talking about mortality. I'm talking about the quality of care as rated by polls. Polls after poll after poll shows people in the other countries are more satisfied with their care than the United States. For crying out loud, I mean, I think Michael Moore addressed this. Cuba, people are more satisfied with their level of care than the United States. How does that happen for the greatest country in the world, granted with all the shootings and obesity, as you just mentioned, but let's go with the moniker greatest country in the world.
Well, why doesn't Michael move to Cuba? And in fact, when he went to get his stomach, what's it called, his intestines tied to lose weight, he didn't go to Cuba for their health care. He went to a private clinic. The Cubans claim their health care is better, and they convince useful idiots like you. But
Well,
so it's not true. They lie about everything else. Why wouldn't they lie about this?
so we're talking about Cuba. And by the way, I saw that. I saw what you did there. I saw how you picked one country and chose to ignore the others. Very, very good sleight of hand. Let's take Cuba out, but the UK, Canada, people more satisfied with their healthcare than the United States. Doesn't that matter if we're talking about quality? Why do we not have healthcare that is to the standards of these people, particularly like in the Scandinavian countries, when we have more resources than any country? It seems to me like this has fallen apart.
Well, you lumped a lot of stuff together there, but people in those countries say that they like their systems because when the pollsters ask them, most people aren't sick. And when you're not sick and you know that you'll just be taken care of, you're pretty happy with the system. When you are sick and, say, in Britain, you get put in the emergency room, left in the hall for 2 or 3 days, and just read the British newspapers. They say they're in crisis. I get distracted by you.
Yeah, it seems like you do. What you say distracted, I say thinly veiled argument. So it seems like you're preying on fear here, right, Dr. Stossel? Fear of the British newspapers, fear of mortality rates being higher, or survival rates being lower.
Fear of being left in the hallway and not getting treatment when I'm really sick. Yeah, I'm scared of that.
But you're worth like what, $40 million? I don't think that's a problem. It might be a problem that the vilified welfare recipient who you addressed earlier might have to face. But Mr. Never Pulled Over, Dr. Stossel, might not really need to be afraid of that. So can we leave the disingenuous arguments maybe at the door?
I don't think it's disingenuous. You brought up England and Canada, and they have great health care as long as you don't need it. But if you need it, you may be in the hallway for a long time, and you may die before you get care.
Didn't Ron Paul? I mean, I assume that you have like a bronze statue of him in your study there. Didn't Ron Paul go to Canada to have a procedure done?
Rand Paul, his son, did, and he went to a private clinic. And Canada, unlike the system proposed by Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris, allows competing private insurance and private medical practice. And he found a good one for his particular problem and went to use it.
So I noticed a trend here. You mentioned Bernie Sanders there, Kamala Harris, and then, very esteemed members of the United States government. And then you mentioned welfare recipients, all of whom would represent minorities in the country. Do you think that maybe you have a blind spot, that maybe your views on healthcare could be perhaps a little racist?
What? I just didn't follow that. But
Kamala Harris.
Race has to do with this.
Well, it just seems the people that you're upset with, right? Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, obviously of Jewish descent. Welfare recipients tend to be people who are often minorities, as your Donald Trump has pointed out. Seems to me your problems tend to be with people in minority classes. No?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
My Donald Trump,
no.
I didn't vote for him. I voted for the libertarian,
Who is that?
Gary Johnson.
Gary Johnson. That's right. That's right. No, because you smoke a lot of pot and stuff. I get it. A lot of people wanted Gary Johnson. Well, good for you. I hope that you feel really good about yourself getting Trump elected, voting for Gary Johnson.
I feel happier that it's Trump than Hillary, although Donald Trump is a really horrible, venal, narcissistic, immature, dangerous person. But I'm still glad he's president rather than Hillary.
You say that with a smirk. Why is that? Why? You mean you mentioned all these negative qualities, and I agree with you on President Trump. But then, how is he better than Hillary? And I wasn't a Hillary fan. Obviously, I was Bernie all the way. But I don't see how that's superior.
Because to me, you asked at the very beginning, what's my issue? My issue is Thomas Jefferson's. He said it's the natural progress of things for government to grow and liberty to yield. And this country succeeded because the founders created an environment where most decisions were left to individuals. And we grew the fastest and went from a poor place to the richest country in the world when government was less than 5% of GDP. Now it's 40 and constantly climbing, and only doesn't eclipse the private sector because the private sector's been growing. And Hillary would have made that worse. Her people would have smothered us with a million little rules. And that really would screw poor people and minorities.
Yeah, it seems to really be screwing people in places like Norway and Denmark and Canada. But it's always interesting to me that people point to Jefferson, and he uses, talking about liberty growing and planting freedom. It's a lot easier to do that when you're people doing your planting and your soil tilling are slaves, right? No.
Slavery was bad. Slavery is bad. Jefferson was wrong about that, but that doesn't make him wrong about everything. And Norway does pretty well because they are a small country with a huge amount of oil.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that you say slavery is bad. At least we agree on that. Something that seems most Americans agree on. And this is something I find curious, considering that you're a libertarian, and I know that you're not a big fan, as you've mentioned, of centralized government and bureaucrats. So it seems to me that you would at least be familiar with the precept of democracy. 70% of American citizens want single-payer health care. 70%. Why does that not? Why do we want to leave that in the hands of a few people in the swamp, as your folk call it? Why should they make a decision that flies in the face of what 70% of Americans want?
We shouldn't leave it in the hand of the swamp. The best system is where individuals pay for their own health care and doctors make their own decision about what they charge. And I'm sure 70% want that, and 70%, including most Republicans, support a minimum wage. And nevertheless, they're all bad ideas.
Wow, there's a switch. You're against any sort of a minimum wage. I want to get back to healthcare, but that's just obviously pretty intense. Where no minimum wage at all. I'm assuming this goes back to your disdain for members of welfare recipients.
Well, actually, minimum wages were passed initially to hurt black people who were coming up from the South and competing with white laborers, and so white legislators passed minimum wage laws to protect white people. But the country grew fastest when employers and workers were free to make their own deal. And that's the best system.
In your estimation, what do you think you think the average wage would be higher if corporations had their way right now without a minimum wage? I mean, is that actually I just want to make sure I understand what you're arguing.
That's what I believe. The economy would be so free and energetic, and the animal spirits of capitalism would lift all boats. Most people would make more.
Then why isn't that the case? It returns to healthcare, which is privatized, which we have insurance companies here. We do not have a socialized system. Why has that not raised all boats when deductibles and premiums are going up and it's becoming unaffordable for the average American family? I'm not seeing the free market really helping them out here, Doctor.
Your assumptions are wrong. It's not private. It's socialized. How can it be private if $7 out of $8 are spent by somebody else?
$7 out of $8. Where are you getting that statistic? You mean 7 out of 8 total dollars in healthcare in the United States are being spent by the government. Is that what you're saying?
Government and private insurance companies.
Okay. Well, okay, so that still would, if the vast majority of those 7 out of 8 would be private insurance companies. That's still a private business model, no?
It's the worst kind of private business model. It's the only thing that works is when you pay, you make the decision. And we see this now with health savings accounts, where the government allows you to put to pay your employees a certain amount into a savings account, a medical savings account that they can spend as they want. And John Mackey of Whole Foods tried this and was surprised to see the reaction among his employees. They at first were nervous, but then started to go to doctors and say, hey, doc, do I really need that MRI, or is there a cheaper place to get it? And do I have to, must this test cost $200? And the doctors often would ask, well, how are you going to pay? I'm going to pay cash. And the doctor would say, really? And you don't have to wait. I won't have to wait 2 months until the insurance company pays me. Well, then maybe $100. And they wouldn't even know where to put it because they haven't had a cash box in doctors' offices for years. But that system brings costs down and makes patients think, which parts of healthcare do I really want? Now, you don't understand this because you're not an old geezer like me, but I get Medicare now. I go to the doctor and nobody even talks about price. I never ask. The doctor never mentions it. I'm sure I get tests that I might not need because the normal price signals that make every other market work don't work in medicine.
So you are taking advantage of Medicare, but you would be against, for example, Medicare for all, which would seem like a common sense solution that I know people like Bernie and Cortez have proposed.
They should take mine away along with everybody else's.
Okay. So let's say but you're using it. So obviously you're being facetious. You're using Medicare.
If the government's going to hand out money, if they're going to give me a deduction for my mortgage, I'm going to take it. Be a fool not to.
And how would you compare your quality of care with Medicare versus private insurance companies? Would you say you're satisfied?
Sometimes not. I don't see a difference between Medicare and private insurance companies when I go to the doctor. The doctor doesn't ask who's going to pay until afterwards.
Right. But you just mentioned, for example, a procedure maybe costing $100 or a few $100s, and you throw those numbers around. What about people who cannot afford that? Your suggestion to them would be, hey, just pay cash because I don't like Medicare. I mean, that's still very expensive. What if someone has a catastrophic healthcare event? What if they get cancer? I mean, they can't pay for these things out of pocket. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in treatment. Let's get real here, right, bro?
First, the reason it's hundreds of thousands of dollars for treatment is they're getting very new and special care that didn't exist before. And only because it costs a lot are companies willing to spend the $1 billion to bring that treatment or drug to market. But secondly, you've heard of Medicaid, right? We do spend $1 trillion on poor people in America. And as a libertarian, I'd be happy to say get rid of that too. Because if we didn't have this behemoth government making all these decisions, then private charities would step in and take care of the poor. And before we had this welfare system, we had enormous numbers of Catholic charities, Jewish charities, non-religious charities who took care of people. We had 14,000 mutual aid societies, and they were often racist. It was whites helping whites, Koreans helping Koreans, blacks helping blacks. But they knew better who needed help and who needed a kick in the butt. Most disappeared when government took it over. But if government disappeared tomorrow, private groups would spring in and do the job better.
Well, hold on a second. It seems like I'm hearing some conflicting evidence from you because you said before private charities were taking care of people, before the government intervened, but now you're talking about all of the expanding medical innovation that's taking place in this country since government intervention. So which is it? Is it before the big welfare state, as you call it, that we had more medical innovation, or the government helping with this, has it actually shown to increase productivity in creating new drugs and life-saving medicine?
No, it doesn't increase productivity. Innovation was happening just as fast or faster before. Now, you could say some of the government funding for basic research has sped innovation, but that's a tiny percentage of what government spends on healthcare.
Where does most of their money go spending then, if not on innovation, right? You say 7 out of $8 is spent by someone else. Where's the government?
Medicare, treatments that government pays for people.
And you would do away with that.
We would pay for it ourselves.
Yeah,
and should.
You would do away with that, which seems like quite a bit of a roll of the dice with people's lives. That if we did away with government, it seems to me that your argument here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if we did away with Medicare and Medicaid and we allowed it to go back to privatization, hopefully some Catholics and racist Koreans would take care of it. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. And obviously it's not going to happen. And it would take time before the private charities would step up. But if the government hadn't stepped up in the first place, there would be vast private charities running hospitals, offering all kinds of healthcare innovation. Think about the Great Depression, how poor America was then. Vast 24% unemployment. People really had no money. How many people starved? Practically no one, because there were all these private charities. Government killed them.
Seems though that more people were starving than without some kind of government intervention. Like if you look at the Model Cities program or what we're doing now, more people were starving in the Great Depression than today. Wouldn't you agree?
At best I could do the research, we found reports in a few states of 24 people who allegedly starved during the Great Depression. I assume now nobody starves. That's true. But now we're vastly richer. Nobody should starve.
Well, there you go. So that's progress. And that would be proof positive that government programs do work. They do help. Fewer people are starving now because there's government infrastructure in place to make sure that they have, a hot meal and clothes on their backs. Hooray, welfare state.
The opposite is true. Fewer people starve because the country got richer because private enterprise made us richer in spite of the welfare state.
Ah, okay. So in spite of it, it correlates exactly to the increase of the welfare state, but it's in spite of it because there's also private companies, right? Am I getting that?
It doesn't correlate exactly to the existence of the welfare state. That didn't begin until the 1960s, and health improved greatly in America before all this government intervention.
Well, right now, I think something that's important when we talk about the free market is that claims are often denied when you're dealing with insurance companies. So unlike unions or workplaces where there's some kind of collective bargaining power, there's no bargaining power with insurance companies. So I get that you don't want the welfare state. I get that you want to do away with Medicare and Medicaid. But would we not agree that making it to where no claims are denied under the current system, that's fair?
No, people would claim all kinds of stuff. People my age think that they're just getting back from Social Security and Medicare what we paid in, that FICA deduction in our checks.
Right.
But on average, we get triple what we paid in because we rudely refuse to die and we keep living longer. And I present this in doing videos to old people in rich retirement communities in Florida. And people say things like, "What? You can't get rid of Medicare. There goes my social life." Old people go hang out in doctor's offices because somebody else will pay. We're already going broke in America, and this is just a recipe to speed it up.
So let me ask this to give you the floor. I'm a little confused. Forgive me. I'm not a doctor, but let me ask you: how would you solve the current healthcare crisis? Then sounds like you're not a fan of insurance companies, but you're also not a fan of single payer. If Dr. John Stossel had his way, how would this work out? What would you do? You could wave your magic wand.
Wow, it's not a question I often get because it's just not going to happen. We would have big health savings accounts. The tax law would change so that it didn't encourage employers to buy catastrophic health insurance for people, that we would make our own decisions. There would be a competing health insurance market, and smart people would only buy insurance against the really big costs that they couldn't afford. And most healthcare spending would be done the way we spend on our iPhones and food. We pay for it ourselves. Costs would stop rising, innovation would increase.
Do you have any examples of this kind of a model working anywhere in a pragmatic sense?
No. And no country has a pure free market system, I mean, except poor countries, and they are poor in a million ways. The countries often cited as single payer, like France, Germany, Switzerland, are not. They have private insurance, and people pay out of their own pocket for a lot of things. Americans don't realize that. But the idea, since Bismarck in Germany, that somebody else should pay for your health care, took over all the advanced countries of the world, and it just grows.
And it just, so you believe that everyone who agrees with that premise, including all of, most of Europe, 70% of Americans, that people should share the burden of healthcare costs. In your estimation, what are they just delusional? Like they're not, I don't understand, when it's overwhelming, does it ever become lonely being so unpopular in your viewpoints?
Yes, often.
It does. Oh, okay.
It does.
So what would you say these 70% of Americans in Europe who they all believe and they all have systems based around shouldering the burden together of the costs, they're just all wrong?
Yeah, they're all wrong. And they don't realize that shouldering it together means over time, innovation slows, some people abuse the system, and everyone is worse off. Eventually they realize it, just as your folks in Venezuela are realizing that now.
Oh, come on. Oh, that's just such a cheap trick. You know that. That's always, people always say your folks, and they point to the worst example of socialism.
Fair criticism. I shouldn't have said that.
I don't know. Can you point to any mainstream American leftist politicians or figures who supported Venezuela or Chavez?
Yeah. Michael Moore, you mentioned him earlier.
Okay. That's fair.
I just saw this video of Bernie Sanders singing in the Soviet Union with his wife. They went there on their honeymoon. Intellectuals have long believed in state planning.
Yeah, I'll admit the optics there aren't good. Let me ask you this, going back to the idea of being a human right. Certain things are basic fundamental human rights. As a libertarian, you obviously believe. Let me ask you this. What do you believe are fundamental rights in the United States? Let's not go global, but what is a human right? Because I think maybe that's where we're missing each other.
That every person has a right to be left alone, to have other people and the government not hurt them or take their stuff. As a libertarian, I do not agree with some of my pure libertarian friends who say that's all government should do. I think we should also have pollution control rules, because there's no good market incentive for me to have a factory that doesn't pollute your air unless government steps in to take care of that. And otherwise, that's it. Those are our right to be left alone and forge our own lives.
So things like police, roads, you don't think the government should be doing things like roads? You don't use roads?
Police is local government. And yeah, people band together and say, we ought to have a police force. And again, right not to be physically hurt or have people take your stuff, that ought to be a basic right. Most of the big roads, the best roads in America, were built by private contractors. People don't know that. I'm here in New York City where everybody talks about the subway as an example of how government has to build the subways because just no capitalist would find a way to make money.
Right, yeah.
People don't know that most of the subways in New York City were built privately and then taken over by the government because the politicians were outraged. They wanted to raise the fare from 5 cents to 10 cents. And now the fare is about $3. And government runs it worse. But the private sector will do a lot of these things better.
Yeah. What about the buses in New York? Is that government?
Some are, and some are not.
Okay.
Most are government. and they're not so great. It's impossible to get fired just about if you're a bad bus driver.
Oh, for a bus driver, I was going to say, yeah, as a passenger, they can kick you off quite promptly. I had that at Penn Station a couple of times.
I don't see that happening very often.
Well,
but entrepreneurs, mostly immigrants, started van service to supplement the government bus service in parts of New York, and the city and the bus drivers' unions got the government to penalize them and in some cases ban them. Government doesn't like competition, especially competition that serves people better for less.
So I guess kind of final couple of questions here. You mentioned having the right to not be hurt by someone else, that you think that's a legitimate role of government, correct?
Physically hurt.
Okay, so physically hurt. So let's change that to, okay, it's the government's job to make sure that someone's not hitting you, right, with a baton or whatever before the gun laws got crazy out of control and we have the mass shootings that we have now on a record scale. But let's just say, okay, you're getting physically hurt.
Scale.
Oh.
The mass shootings are not up. There's just more media coverage of.
Yeah, well, tell that to the victims of Sandy Hook and in Vegas, and But hey, different strokes. I wouldn't. Maybe some of them were welfare recipients. All right, so let's just change this to someone hitting you and assaulting you. It's the government's right. It's their duty, their job, a legitimate role for them to step in and protect you. Now, change that person hitting you to, for example, a pharmaceutical company or an insurance company, taking advantage of somebody, denying a claim, making drugs or services unaffordable so that that person is, when we're talking about very real physical harm, facing death in the absence of fundamental health care.
Yeah, very different. They're not hitting me. They're saying, I made this thing and you can't have it unless you pay me. And they have every right to do that.
So how would you help these people who, for example, can't afford it? People who can't afford this care, and they're just, okay, is your alternative for them to die and decrease the surplus population? I'm trying to understand how this works in a real world setting. People need health care. Some people can't get it. What do you do with them?
Two things will help, though. One, if you let the market work, the prices will come down so they can afford most everything. And secondly, private charity will help people.
Private charity, and that's where we go back to the Koreans helping Koreans and the blacks only helping blacks and whites only helping whites. This is the John Stossel utopia for America. I just want to make sure that we're not getting wires crossed.
Americans are pretty generous. I gave a lot of money to charities last year, and I think we who have done well in life want to help other people, and will.
How would you explain then the rich just keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer and the middle class is disappearing, if that's the case?
That all those assumptions are wrong. The middle class is disappearing because more of them are becoming rich. The rich are getting absurdly rich, mostly because the stock market keeps going up. But the poor aren't getting poorer. The average income has gone up, not as much as the rich, but it's gone up. Plus, poor people have access to things like iPhones, which make their lives better, created by capitalism.
Yeah.
Perfect isn't one of the choices.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, people now have addictions to their phones because of capitalism, and we see that as a success. So I don't know that I would agree with you. Any closing thoughts on socialized healthcare, where people can go to hear more of your arguments? If there's anything that you would like to leave people with that have gotten incorrect, because I want to recap. I think that healthcare is a human right. I believe in not letting people die and being compassionate. And you just want people to buy healthcare, and if they can't, to die. Do I have that about right? You can. Final word.
Final word is that I congratulate you in that even though I have a hunch that StevenCrowder is behind you, you get me going in this process. Get me worked up. Secondly, every week I make a short video that does a much more articulate job than I've done today arguing these points. And I hope your listeners can find that.
And where would they find that? I want to be generous here with the plugs.
Stossel TV. Just Google it.
Stossel TV, and that's on Facebook, YouTube, and John. I also believe just at johnstossel.com. Okay, what was it? What was your PhD in what was that, Dr. Stossel?
No PhD.
Oh.
Higher education is a waste of money for most non-intellectual people like me.
Okay, so not Dr. Stossel, johnstossel.com. Thank you very much. This has been Devil's Advocate, Skyler Turden, your host. We provide the information, you decide. We'll see you soon, guys. Thank you. How do we get out? Hey there, I hope you enjoyed this segment. We've done it quite a few times. I believe this is the fourth or fifth time, and it allows us to really shine a light on the alt-right, the conservative right, whatever they want to call themselves today. And you can hear arguments from both sides. Watch one of these videos playing in a box next to me, or subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified of any future installments. We're really hoping to get on YouTube Red, and just waiting for green light from Wojcicki, so we're doing pretty well.